The year is 2078. Humanity stands on the brink of a new era. The day that once seemed impossible has finally come. Railguns are no longer just the stuff of science fiction. They are real, they are here, and they are reshaping the world in ways no one could have imagined. The world had long dreamed of such technology, but no one had the courage to believe it would happen in their lifetime. The idea that a weapon powerful enough to launch projectiles at unimaginable speeds could be created seemed absurd, yet here it was. The first fully operational railgun had been built and tested successfully. The world watched as a single shot from the weapon destroyed an entire building miles away on the edge of a remote testing site. It was a moment that would change the course of history. No longer was the world bound by the limitations of traditional weaponry. Railguns promised something entirely different, an unparalleled force capable of reshaping not just the battlefield, but industries across the globe. From space exploration to mining to resource extraction, railguns had the potential to unlock new frontiers humanity had always dreamed of exploring. But the true test came when the unexpected happened. Deep in the reaches of space, humanity discovered they were not alone. For centuries, they had looked to the stars with curiosity and ambition. But the truth had always been more complicated than they realized. The aliens had been watching from a distance, slowly observing as humanity advanced, growing more curious with each passing year. And now they had decided it was time to make their presence known. What they had not counted on was humanity's newfound power. As soon as the first alien ships crossed into the solar system, humanity's leaders knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to defend themselves. Despite their technological advancements, there was no guarantee humanity could survive such an invasion, but the railguns offered hope. For the first time, humanity had a weapon capable of striking back on a scale previously unthinkable. The aliens who had come to Earth with an air of superiority were about to learn just how dangerous humanity could be. The decision to deploy the railguns was made almost immediately. With a fleet of ships armed with these new weapons, humanity's military prepared for battle against the invaders. But there was more to it than just defense. Humanity was ready not just to protect their home, but to send a message to the stars to show the aliens that Earth was not a planet to be taken lightly. They were about to find out what happens when you push humanity too far. With each passing moment, tensions grew higher. The countdown had begun, and the world held its breath, waiting for the moment that would define their future forever. In space, the first salvo was launched. The alien fleet never saw it coming. A flash of light as the first railgun shot sliced through the vacuum of space and hit its target. The shockwave rippled outward, obliterating the alien ship before it even had a chance to respond. Within moments, another shot was fired, and then another. The railgun proved itself not just a tool, but a weapon that could change the course of history forever. Humanity had struck back, and the aliens had been caught completely off guard. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and innovate. Now, the battle for survival had truly begun. The sound of victory was deafening. The first alien ship had been obliterated before it even had time to react. The railgun's power had sent a clear message: humanity was not to be underestimated. The world watched in stunned silence as the news spread across every screen and device. Humans had just made the impossible a reality. The alien fleet hovering in orbit around Earth had not expected such a quick and devastating strike. Their advanced technologies had led them to believe they were untouchable, but they had not accounted for the ingenuity of humanity. What had once been a mere dream of science fiction was now a weapon that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. The aliens quickly regrouped their forces and began to form a defensive line in orbit around Earth. Their ships were massive and heavily armored, but they were not prepared for the sheer speed and force of the railguns. Humanity had developed. The next wave of shots came from the fleet stationed near Earth's moon, a series of powerful blasts that hit with pinpoint accuracy, sending shockwaves through the alien armada. The railguns were unstoppable, tearing through the alien ships as if they were made of paper. Their advanced armor was no match for the incredible velocity of the projectiles that tore through their hulls. As though the ships were made of nothing but thin air, alien ships began to retreat, but it was clear that they were not going to leave Earth without a fight. The humans were not going to let up either. The railguns continued to fire, each shot more precise and devastating than the last. The aliens attempted to retaliate, launching countermeasures that were designed to deflect the railgun fire, but their efforts were in vain. Nothing could stop the destructive force of the railguns. As the battle raged on, the world's leaders began to see that this was not just a defense of Earth. It was a defining moment in the story of humanity's place in the universe. Humanity had taken the fight to the stars, and with the power of the railguns at their disposal, they were proving that they could stand on equal footing with any force in the galaxy. However, even as the railguns struck down the alien ships one after another, a new realization began to sink in. The more victories humanity secured, the more alien ships appeared from the depths of space. It was clear that this was just the beginning. What started as a single skirmish had evolved into something far larger. The alien fleet was not retreating, they were regrouping and reinforcing their forces. The war was only escalating, and humanity was about to find out just how much of their own power they had unleashed in their struggle for survival. Though the railguns were proving their worth on the battlefield, the damage to Earth's infrastructure was beginning to take its toll. The energy required to keep the railguns firing was immense, and the planet's resources were being drained faster than they could be replenished. Every shot from the railguns required more and more power, and the question loomed: how long could humanity continue to sustain such an effort? As the war stretched on, and the stakes grew higher, the true cost of their technological leap became apparent. The railguns were humanity's greatest strength, but they also came with a heavy price. As humanity celebrated their early victories, the reality of their situation began to set in. The war was far from over, and the cost of using the railguns to their full potential was starting to show. The power required to keep the weapons operational was unsustainable. Earth's energy grid was starting to buckle under the strain, and political leaders began to voice concerns about the long-term consequences of relying on such a destructive force to defend the planet. The unity that had been forged in the face of the alien threat was beginning to fray as different factions began to push their own agendas. Some advocated for an all-out war against the aliens to drive them from the solar system. Others called for caution, suggesting that humanity might be overextending itself by using the railguns as the ultimate weapon. Despite the growing divisions on Earth, the railguns remained humanity's primary advantage on the battlefield, and the alien forces had learned to fear them. Their massive ships had been decimated by the precision of the railgun strikes, and now they were adapting their tactics to avoid further destruction. Alien warships began to form more defensive formations and launch counterattacks that tested the limits of humanity's ability to respond. But no matter how they adapted, the railguns were still proving to be far more powerful than any weapon they had encountered before. Still, there were whispers of a larger threat lurking just beyond the solar system, something far more powerful than the current alien invaders, and the fear was beginning to spread among the ranks of humanity's leaders. Could they truly stand against an even greater force? If this was only the beginning, could humanity's railguns be enough to save them? Or would they find themselves facing annihilation at the hands of something more powerful than they could ever imagine? In the midst of these fears, a new figure emerged from the shadows: Dr. Aria Sinclair, a brilliant but controversial scientist. Known for her radical theories on energy and weaponry, she presented an idea that could revolutionize the way humanity approached the war with the aliens. She suggested that instead of relying on conventional railguns, humanity could develop an entirely new weapon powered by a sustainable energy source that would provide infinite firepower without depleting the planet's resources. At first, her ideas were met with skepticism. Many believed she was simply trying to profit from the war, but Dr. Sinclair was relentless. She had proof that her technology could work, and she was willing to stake her reputation on it. She worked tirelessly to gain the support of key leaders and military officials, and after much resistance, a small group of scientists and engineers was assembled to begin work on her energy source. It was an audacious plan, one that could change the course of the war, and perhaps even the fate of humanity itself. But as Dr. Sinclair's project began to take shape, another challenge arose. The political landscape of Earth was shifting as nations competed for control over the railgun technology, and its potential for even greater power. The balance of power was delicate, and some feared that the very weapon that had given humanity its edge in the war might become its undoing. Humanity was becoming more divided than ever, and the question was not whether they could win the war, but whether they could hold onto the unity that had made their success possible. The stakes were higher than ever as new factions began to rise up, seeking to control not just the future of the war, but the future of humanity itself. The tension across Earth was palpable as the war against the aliens raged on. The railguns continued to prove their worth, but their cost was growing exponentially as the energy needed to fire them drained the planet's resources at an alarming rate. The fear was mounting that humanity's reliance on these weapons was unsustainable. Already global power grids were starting to fail, with entire regions plunged into darkness as they fought to keep the railguns operational. Governments began scrambling for answers, but the more they tried to solve the problem, the more they realized there were no easy solutions. The railguns had given humanity an edge in the war, but that very edge was now threatening to cripple the planet's infrastructure. Entire cities were in blackout for days at a time as critical power plants were pushed past their limits. Humanity had come to rely on these weapons so much that the question was no longer whether they could win the war, but whether they could continue to sustain the war at all. With the alien fleet still lurking in orbit and reinforcements arriving from across the galaxy, the pressure on Earth's leaders only intensified. The divisions between nations deepened. Some factions argued that the war should be fought until the aliens were driven from the solar system, while others feared that such a relentless pursuit would bring humanity to the brink of collapse. One thing was certain: the railguns were a double-edged sword. Their power had brought humanity victories, but it had also opened up a can of worms that no one could have predicted. In the midst of these growing concerns, a quiet proposal began to circulate among the military elite, a radical idea that could change the entire course of the war and perhaps save humanity from the brink of disaster. The proposal was simple in theory, but incredibly difficult in practice: to develop a new energy source capable of sustaining the railguns indefinitely. But the technology required to do so was nothing short of revolutionary. The concept was rooted in the work of Dr. Area Sinclair, whose theories about sustainable energy had gained traction among a small group of influential leaders. It was her vision that had sparked the idea of creating an entirely new energy grid built to fuel the railguns without draining Earth's resources. The idea was bold. It was the only hope humanity had of overcoming the alien threat, while also preventing their own self-destruction. But implementing it would require a complete reorganization of Earth's power systems. Entire cities would need to be restructured, entire industries would need to adapt, and it would require an investment of resources that many were unwilling to give. A small faction within the government began to push the idea forward, but not without resistance. Others who had been in power for decades feared that the proposal would upset the delicate balance they had cultivated, and some of the world's richest corporations saw it as a threat to their bottom lines. As political factions fought over how best to proceed, Dr. Sinclair's team was working around the clock to develop the new technology, but their progress was slow and plagued by setbacks. The pressure from the growing alien fleet was beginning to feel insurmountable, and every day that passed was another day that humanity risked losing its edge in the war. But amid the chaos, a new player emerged in the conflict. A rogue group of former military officers and engineers who had once been part of the railgun program, but had been ousted for their extreme ideas, began to take matters into their own hands. They believed the solution was not in a new energy source, but in pushing the limits of the railgun technology further. They had developed a new prototype that could generate enough power to fire the railguns continuously without a need for external energy sources. But their methods were unorthodox and dangerous. Their new railgun prototype was a gamble that could either save humanity or doom them forever. As tensions reached a boiling point across Earth, the rogue faction, led by former military engineers and disillusioned scientists, pushed forward with their untested railgun prototype. Their plan was simple but fraught with danger. If successful, their new weapon could fire continuously without draining Earth's already exhausted energy resources. But if it failed, it could unleash a catastrophe unlike any humanity had ever seen. The faction had secured funding and resources through clandestine means. With the help of powerful allies in the black market, they had kept their progress hidden from the world's governments, who had grown wary of any further developments in railgun technology. But their secrecy was starting to unravel. Whispers began to spread among the military high command about the existence of this rogue project, and as the alien threat continued to intensify, there were concerns that the faction might be operating outside the bounds of any agreed-upon military protocol. The new prototype railgun was being constructed in a remote facility on a distant moon. Its design was radically different from anything previously developed. Its power source, a new type of particle accelerator, was capable of channeling energy in a way that could sustain a constant firing cycle. The engineers and scientists working on the project were cautiously optimistic, but they also knew that the risks of such a radical approach were enormous. A single miscalculation could destroy the facility and every living being within miles of it. And yet, as the alien forces drew nearer, the rogue faction pressed on. They believed they had no choice. The traditional railguns were too expensive and too dependent on Earth's dwindling resources. They had to find a solution before it was too late. But Dr. Area Sinclair, who had become one of the few remaining voices of reason in the scientific community, was growing increasingly concerned about the direction the project was taking. She had once been a staunch advocate for innovation, but she had never believed in cutting corners when it came to weaponry, and the rogue faction's prototype felt dangerously close to pushing the limits of responsible science. She knew that if this new weapon succeeded, it could change the course of the war, but if it failed, it could result in the kind of collateral damage that would destroy everything humanity had fought for. She also knew that the growing tensions between Earth's political factions were making the situation even more volatile. The same factions that had supported the railgun program now found themselves divided over the rogue project. Some saw it as a necessary gamble, others viewed it as a reckless and irresponsible endeavor that would only escalate the war. Dr. Sinclair had tried to raise awareness about the dangers of unregulated development, but her voice was drowned out by the growing political and military pressure. She couldn't help but feel that humanity was rushing headlong into something they were not prepared for. But in the end, the battle for control over the railgun technology was not just about defeating the aliens. It was about power and who would control the future of humanity. The divide between the military elite and the emerging rogue faction became more pronounced each day. The power struggle was becoming increasingly bitter, with both sides using the war as a cover for their own agendas. While Dr. Sinclair and other moderate voices struggled to keep a fragile peace, the alien fleet continued its steady advance, and the clock was ticking. The fate of humanity hung in the balance, and it was no longer clear who was in control of their own destiny. As new factions emerged within the military vying for control of the railguns and the rogue weapon, the question now was no longer whether humanity could survive, but who would be left standing at the end of it all. The tension had reached a breaking point. The rogue faction's railgun prototype was nearing completion, and the pressure was mounting both from within humanity and from the alien invaders. The alien forces had regrouped and begun to push deeper into Earth's orbit. Their fleets were growing larger and more formidable, and they were relentless in their assault on humanity's defenses. Each day that passed brought new devastation. The railguns, though still humanity's greatest weapon, had been taxed to their limits, and with the energy grid in shambles, there was no longer a guarantee that they could be kept operational for much longer. The rogue faction's prototype was seen as the final solution. One way or another, it would tip the scales in humanity's favor, but not without risks. With so much uncertainty surrounding its success or failure, it felt like humanity was gambling everything on a single shot, one that could either win the war or doom them all. Dr. Area Sinclair had been monitoring the rogue project from afar, her concerns growing with each passing day. The secrecy with which it had been developed, the unregulated methods used by the faction, the lack of oversight, all of it gnawed at her. As much as she wanted to see a solution to the energy crisis and the war, she couldn't shake the feeling that the prototype was playing with fire. She tried once more to warn the higher-ups of the potential disaster that could arise from the rogue railgun, But her warnings were ignored. They were focused on the bigger picture. The final battle with the aliens that was drawing near the prototype was their best hope, the only hope. As the facility on the moon completed its preparations, Dar Sinclair found herself being drawn into a deeper web of politics and intrigue. She had been approached by an underground faction within the government who had long suspected the rogue engineers were pushing too far. They offered her a choice: join them and expose the project for the disaster it could be, or continue working within the established military chain and risk becoming part of the problem. Sinclair knew she could not stand by and do nothing, so she made the decision to take matters into her own hands. With a small team of trusted scientists and engineers, she infiltrated the facility on the moon where the rogue prototype was being built. She needed to see it for herself, to understand the true scope of the danger, and to stop it if necessary. When she arrived, the scale of the operation was far beyond what she had imagined. The facility was a vast complex built deep beneath the moon's surface. The rogue faction had spared no expense in its construction. It was a machine of war designed to do one thing, and one thing only: fire the new railgun prototype at full capacity without fail. If successful, it would destroy the alien fleet. But if it malfunctioned, it could wipe out everything in the surrounding area in a chain reaction that would devastate the moon itself and potentially Earth's entire solar system. Sinclair's heart raced as she walked through the darkened halls of the facility. Everything felt off, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up the closer she got to the core of the project. She knew that she had little time to act. The alien fleet had already detected human movement on the moon's surface and was preparing to launch another wave of attacks. Humanity's window of survival was closing fast. Sinclair and her team had to make a decision now: either shut down the prototype before it was too late, or risk everything on a weapon that might just end up being more dangerous than the aliens themselves. Dar Sinclair's heart pounded in her chest as she and her team navigated the darkened halls of the rogue faction's lunar facility. The tension in the air was suffocating. They were running out of time, and each second that passed brought them closer to an irreversible decision. The prototype railgun was nearly ready for its first live test, but there were no guarantees that it would fire safely. Even after all the progress the rogue faction had made, there were still fundamental flaws in the design that no one could fully predict. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was no longer just a scientific issue. It was a matter of survival for humanity. If the rogue prototype succeeded, it could devastate the alien fleet and shift the tide of war in humanity's favor. But if it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. She moved quickly through the facility, guided only by dim emergency lights that flickered overhead. Each hallway was filled with the hum of machinery and the smell of ionized air. The final stages of construction were taking place deep within the heart of the complex. It was there that the core of the prototype was located. It stood in a massive chamber surrounded by thick steel walls and reinforced glass windows. The enormous energy generator at its center pulsed with power, a beacon of raw force, ready to be unleashed. Dar Sinclair motioned for her team to stop. As they reached the door leading into the chamber, they would need to bypass the security systems to access the prototype itself, and time was slipping away. The alien fleet was closing in on Earth, and there was no telling how much longer humanity's defenses could hold out. If the railguns were no longer viable, the rogue faction's plan had to succeed, or Earth would be defenseless. Sinclair quickly assessed the security measures. It was more complex than she had anticipated, but she had come prepared. She motioned to the team's lead engineer, a young but capable scientist named Jonah, to begin hacking the system. While she kept watch, Jonah's fingers flew over the console. As he worked to bypass the locks, the seconds ticked by with excruciating slowness. Every moment that passed increased the chances of being discovered by either the rogue engineers or, worse, the alien scouts circling the moon. Their ships had already begun scanning the surface, looking for anything unusual. Sinclair felt her mind racing. She couldn't allow them to be caught. She couldn't allow this weapon to be fired if it wasn't safe. She could already hear the distant rumble of the alien fleet outside the moon's orbit growing closer as the pressure mounted. Jonah finally made a sound of triumph. The door to the chamber opened with a soft hiss, and the team rushed inside. Dar Sinclair's eyes locked onto the prototype immediately. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, towering above them. The machine seemed almost alive with energy. Its massive barrels hummed with anticipation. The particle accelerator at its heart was already primed and ready to fire at a moment's notice. But as Sinclair moved closer, she could see the cracks in the design. The heat signatures were uneven, the energy readings unstable. This wasn't the weapon that could win the war. It was a time bomb waiting to explode. She turned to her team members, who were already beginning to disconnect the power lines to shut the system down. It was then that they heard the unmistakable sound of alarms echoing through the facility. The rogue faction had discovered their presence, and now they were racing toward the prototype with one goal: to stop them from deactivating the weapon. Sinclair's pulse quickened, but she refused to hesitate. The fate of humanity rested on their ability to shut down the prototype before it was too late. She knew that time had run out, and if they couldn't stop it, the consequences would be catastrophic. They had to finish the job before the rogue engineers or the aliens could stop them. The alarms grew louder as Sinclair and her team scrambled to disconnect the power lines from the rogue prototype. The facility was now on lockdown, and the rogue faction was closing in on their position. They had to move fast. Time was running out. The alien fleet had already launched its assault, and Earth's defenses were weakening by the minute. They couldn't afford to be caught here. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Sinclair knew that if they didn't deactivate the railgun now, it would fire, and if that happened, the entire moon could be reduced to rubble in seconds. The rogue engineers were relentless in their pursuit. They had placed security teams throughout the facility, and as Sinclair's team raced through the maze of corridors, it was clear that they were not going to make it out unnoticed. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, and before they knew it, the rogue faction had surrounded them. They had nowhere to go, no time left to complete the mission. Sinclair looked around at her team, knowing they had done everything they could to stop the weapon. But now it was up to them to escape the consequences of their failure. She glanced back at the massive prototype. The power readings were spiking as the energy surged through the accelerator. They had only moments left before it was too late. With no other choice, Sinclair made a split-second decision. She turned to Jonna, the young engineer who had been instrumental in hacking the security systems earlier, and gave him a silent nod. He understood immediately. Jonna ran toward the control console with a sense of urgency and began typing rapidly. The rogue engineers outside were growing more frantic as they tried to breach the door to the chamber, but Sinclair and her team had no intention of going down without a fight. They were determined to stop the weapon, even if it cost them everything. The energy readings on the console flickered erratically. The prototype was close to firing, and if it did, it would cause an explosion powerful enough to send shockwaves across the solar system. Sinclair's pulse raced as she watched Jonna's fingers fly across the console at a speed that almost seemed superhuman. Finally, there was a click, and a burst of static filled the room. The power lines that had been feeding the prototype were cut off. The energy readings began to drop. But it wasn't enough, not yet. The rogue engineers burst into the chamber and immediately started firing their weapons. Sinclair's team returned fire with everything they had, but the odds were against them. The enemy outnumbered them, and they were in an all-out battle for survival. Jonna didn't stop. He kept typing relentlessly, trying to override the fail-safe systems. As the room filled with chaos, Sinclair knew they were running out of time. She could see the alien fleet ships growing ever closer in the distance. They had just moments to finish what they started. Finally, with a final keystroke, Jonna collapsed back into his seat. The system was shut down. The railgun prototype had been deactivated. The room fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing from Sinclair's team. They had done it. They had stopped the weapon from firing. But at what cost? The rogue engineers were defeated, but many lives had been lost, and there was no time to mourn the victory. Yet the war was not over, and the alien fleet was preparing for the final push toward Earth. The real battle was about to begin. Sinclair stood up and addressed her team. We've won this round, but the war is far from over. We have to prepare for what comes next. Earth is counting on us to survive and to defend it. The future of humanity rested on their shoulders, and there was no turning back. The alien threat was still looming large, and the fate of the solar system was uncertain. But one thing was clear: humanity had proven they could fight back. They had taken on the odds, and one even when the weapon meant to save them had nearly destroyed them all. Humanity had shown that they would never back down from a fight, no matter the cost.